Hey, Diana, did you know that sales can make or break your business?
Mark, you finally said something smart.
And welcome to the Successful Barrister Podcast, the podcast for lawyers about marketing, management, and life skills that probably won't get you disbarred. I am your host, Marc Whitehead, alongside my co-host, Diana Berry, my right hand, my COO. Hey, Diana, what's up?
Not much, Mark. It's a rainy whatever day it is in Houston.
It is Wednesday.
Thank you. I don't know what year it is either, so don't ask the hard questions.
You've been frazzled the last couple of days. So.
I'd go with weeks. It's been a hectic April,
okay.
March.
Well, but next week is going to be good. So actually this week. So we're doing our 2-day offsite starting tomorrow.
And why do we do a 2-day offsite?
It is an EOS requirement where we go spend 2 days offsite. We're going to Galveston with our leadership team and with our implementor. And we're going to spend 2 days doing debrief and annual planning.
Annual planning, yep. And then turn around on Monday and go where?
We're going to Denver. We're going to PILMA, the Personal Injury Lawyer Marketing and Management Association, the longest worded name organization out there, for 2 days to talk about marketing and
2 days?
I'm sorry, 4 days. 4 days.
Monday to Friday.
Showing up Monday, leaving Friday. Combining this with a college visitation trip with my daughter. We're going to visit University of Denver to check that campus out.
For you. The rest of us don't get to go.
No, y'all don't get
colleges.
to go. Y'all don't get to go to the college tour.
That's okay, though. But today, what's today's talking points?
So today we are talking about intake, particularly our intake department, or what the rest of the world would call a sales department. In the legal industry, we think sales is a dirty word, so we came up with the word intake. But really, that's why you have to think about it. It's your sales department. You know, every business, has a marketing function where they try to grab attention, and then you have a sales function where you try to convert that attention into paying customers. Then you have an operations department, which actually performs the service that you've promised to provide, and then hopefully the flywheel comes back around and your happy clients will refer you more business and you go right back to the top of the funnel again. So I was listening to a podcast the other day. I want to say it was Tim Ferriss's 22-hour book that you made me buy on Audible.
Oh, are you liking it?
So I'm picking around. I'm jumping around, looking from topic to topic. And one of the things that they were talking about was, what would you tell your younger self if you could go back and talk to your younger self? In my case, 33 years ago.
Tribe of Mentors, right?
Right.
Okay.
What would I tell myself? What one piece of business advice or personal advice would you give yourself? So I was thinking about that last night. And the one piece of business advice, if I could just do one, that I would give myself, my 33-year-old younger self, was I would establish a dedicated intake/sales department for my law firm.
Earlier.
Way
So where were
earlier.
you in your practice that you felt comfortable doing that? How many years?
It would have been in about 2008, 2009.
The aughts.
In the aughts.
So how many years is that? I mean, I'm not trying to date you or anything.
Okay. Well, let's say I started practicing in 92. And
Okay, so you're going to give them all the details.
Dead in the middle of halfway. So it was, my 33 years, it was 15 years in practice.
And when would you establish? When do you think a person should establish their own intake department?
Day one.
Oh, okay.
Day one. And it's so important for so many reasons. And I've pissed away so many tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars in my career, maybe even millions of dollars, in my career by not having a dedicated intake department from the get-go. And I'll give you some examples. Here's how we used to do it. It used to be I did all of the interviewing and all of the closing. So in other words, we're a contingency fee law firm. Somebody would come, they would see our Yellow Page ad back in the day. They would call, the receptionist would make an appointment. They would come into my office. I would meet with them. And if they met criteria and if I could convince them, that we were the right lawyer, they would sign on the dotted line. And that was our sales department. I was our sales department.
Wow.
I.e., I was a massive choke point.
You were a bottleneck for sure.
How many opportunities did we miss back then by not having a dedicated sales department that was separate from me? Because lawyers are hard to schedule. We were making clients come into the office. We office downtown. They had to come downtown. They had to find parking.
Pay for parking.
I mean, we did validate, but, it was still a hassle. How many no-shows do you think I had back then? If we set an appointment, we probably had about a 50% no-show rate.
Wow.
50% of all of our leads never showed up because they just, for whatever reason, I'm just going to call this guy down the street as opposed to driving into downtown. So untold amounts of money, just never showed up.
Yeah.
Because of that.
So I want to go back to something you said before about the whole me thing, that you were the bottleneck. I just want to kind of tease that a little bit more. It's not you as the managing partner. It's just you as an attorney. I think that can't be said enough, that your attorneys really shouldn't be involved in your intake process. I mean, yes, when they get into the yellow buckets, but I'm sure you'll talk about that later.
Right.
But having your attorneys in the middle of your intake process is probably not wise.
Right. It's not wise. It just slows the system down. It bogs everything down. And even back then, the smart attorneys were making house calls. This was back in the day. This was literally before even most people had cell phones, and they certainly didn't have internet or anything like that. But the smart lawyers, would send, if somebody called and it sounded good over the phone, they would send an investigator, what they would call, quote unquote, an investigator, which is probably just a glorified paralegal. And they would go make house visits, and they would sign the person up in their house before they could ever leave to wander off. That's what the smart people did. I didn't know that. Nobody ever told me that. But that's what the smart ones did. Eventually, I figured that out. And then what I did was I started making the house calls myself.
Oh.
I remember one day that I had 5 pretty decent cases on the line, and they were all out in the rural areas. One was in Brazos County, which is about 2 hours away. One was up in Wharton County. One was way out in East Texas. And I made a big circle. I left at 6 o'clock in the morning, and I went and visited each of these 5 potential people and signed up 5 cases.
Oh, okay.
Worked really well, but what is my time worth? How much can I do that?
Well, and you really didn't do any lawyering or production that day.
I probably didn't do any for several days because I was probably exhausted by the time I got home. But at least I started evolving. My thinking started to evolve. That this setting an appointment and just sitting back and hoping they show up wasn't the way to do it. So as we evolved and we became more of a disability practice, I realized I was the choke point. And I started letting my paralegals screen the leads, okay? And letting them make the decisions and letting them sign up cases, and I would only break the tie if they weren't sure. Here's the fundamental problem with that. When your paralegal is busy and overworked, they will turn down good cases left and right because they're just busy and they just I don't need any more caseload.
Yeah.
And that was worse than me doing it.
Yeah.
And it took me a long time to figure out what they were doing. And it wasn't until one of my first marketing directors convinced me, hey, Marc, my mom could be great at this. She was retired at that point. And she goes, I bet you I could talk my mom out of retirement and she could come in and she could do all the interviewing and closing all the cases for you. And I said, but she's not a paralegal, is she? No, she's not. She's never worked in the legal industry. And it took her weeks of her badgering me before I finally relented. And I hired my first intake specialist, dedicated intake specialist that did nothing but talk to new leads all day long. So that's kind of how it happened.
Why did your paralegal, what was it in her mom's background that said, hey, I think my mom could do a really good job?
Her mom loved to talk.
Oh, high I.
She was a high I. Her mom loved to talk. She goes, and quite frankly, her mom needed a job. So I think there was a lot of
But you're looking
reasons.
for a high I.
Yeah. So that's the first time I actually had a full-time intake specialist. And it worked really, really, really well. And from there, I decided we need to systematize this better. And I think what we're going to talk about throughout this podcast is I'm going to kind of go through what I have found has worked and maybe some of the things that have not worked in the development of our intake department. So I would just, for point of reference, today we have an intake manager who manages about 10 to 12 intake specialists. We have fairly sophisticated software, Litify. We have sophisticated reporting.
Through our phone system.
Through our phone system. We have HubSpot. We have all sorts of sophisticated technology these days that prints out all of these brilliant reports. I can tell you how well our marketing is doing. I can tell you how well our intake is doing. I can tell you all of these things because we become very sophisticated in the process. Relative to the days when I used to get in my car and drive 200 miles in a day to visit people over all of East Texas, probably in your hometown.
I don't think you got that far.
You don't think I got up all the way to center Texas?
Oh, goodness,
the center of the universe is what I call it.
It's definitely the center of the county. So we're going to talk about kind of what Marc Whitehead and Associates does. Any last closing points before we move to that?
So I know a lot of people, the big sticking point that everybody has in this concept is that I'm a lawyer. Only I can talk to the clients. Only I can convince a client to sign with us. And I used to think that. And that is a total mental block that is not true whatsoever. And I'm going to spend the rest of this podcast trying to convince you that you're not that damn important.
But thank you for listening to our podcast.
But thank you for listening. We still love you. But you're just not that damn important. All right. And with that, we'll be back in just a minute. All right, so we're talking about how we developed our intake department over the years. And I think the first point that you have to make that lawyers need to understand is your intake process, whatever it is, whether you're the process or it's your staff or you have a dedicated intake department, that first initial contact is where trust is built with the client. Okay, so you always have to start with that premise that the point of intake, now that you've gotten their attention, so whatever marketing methods you use to get them to call you, now is the point where you start having to build trust. And there are some very specific ways that you can go about to build trust with a client, whether it is you, whether it is a paralegal, whether it's an intake specialist. And I think you start off with the concept of the first impression is the only impression that really lasts. And that's my opinion. And so you want to start with empathy. Nobody calls us because something good happened to them. They're always calling in a probably one of the most stressful times in their life. So that's where you start with building trust, is you build with empathy. You understand their situation. You identify with some of their common pain points. You come up with solutions. All right, we can help. You reassure them. But that's when you start looking for who you want to hire in your intake department. That is where you start. You want to start with somebody who clearly can demonstrate empathy. What we would call, a high I under the DISC test. Somebody that has a lot. I'm getting there. I know you're giving me the eye roll.
Yeah, not eye roll, but definitely some side eye.
Some side eye. I'm getting some side eye over here. So the high I, describe a high I in your opinion.
An extrovert.
An extrovert.
In one very simple word, but an extrovert does not necessarily mean that they can...
Exactly. Does not mean sympathetic.
Or doesn't mean that they are capable of empathy, or that
Correct.
They're very high on the empathetic score.
So you need to look at that from those two angles. You would like somebody who is an extrovert, but you also want somebody that has the empathy factor, of which I don't think DISC really tests for that.
No, usually you would look for an EQ score there. We do not use an EQ test for that. We look for an IS on our intake specialists.
Right. You want somebody that's an extrovert and somebody that's very steady, because being on the phone all day can be a grind. It takes a special personality to find that person who's willing to do that. All of this, to some extent, can be controlled and be trained. So our intake system, we use Litify as our intake system and as our case management system. That's the great thing about Litify. I can do both. And it's set up in such a way that we can develop scripts and scenarios and sort of if-thens, depending on how complicated you want to get with your programming. Although sometimes simpler is better. Mm-hmm. So let's say, for example, this person calls in. What's the first thing that you want? You want to get that intake specialist to exhibit some form of sympathy, empathy. I understand you've made the right call. You've called the right place. Let's discuss your case. Let's see what's going on. And then you take them through the script. And you need to develop your scripts, extremely well. And you need to train on that. We do a lot of training with our intake staff on the proper questions to ask, the things to look for, because ultimately we want what we want. The goal is that we would like the intake person to make a decision on that very first call, whether this client falls within our acceptable criteria, what we would call a green bucket case, or whether they're a yellow bucket. In other words, there's questions and then you're not quite sure, so they need to run it up to a higher authority, either their intake manager or run it up to an attorney. Or if they're a red bucket, they clearly don't meet our criteria, and then we need to do a gentle turn down or referral. But that's what we want to do. We want to train them to do that. And we have very specific criteria on how we set that up. But let's assume they are a green bucket. What we want to do is we want to close that call. We want to close that sale. We want to get that client to sign our contingency fee contract right then and there. We don't want to let them off the phone, which is way different from the old days when you had them come into the office, or even in the aughts where we used to overnight the contract to them. Nowadays we use, DocuSign or some form of e-signature where they can sign right there on their phone, the same phone they're calling on. So this is where you want to go with this whole process, is you want to develop what we call a one-call close system, where the client never gets to wander off. If the client is a client you want to take, you want to know it then, and you want to sign them right then before they ever get a chance to wander off. And then that way you set the hook, and they're your client forever, or at least through the course of this particular case.
And I think every step of what you just described is something that we kind of develop over time. That one page, green, yellow, red. You've had that ever since I've gotten here, but I know we've looked at it nearly every year to make sure that still fits our criteria.
We revise it a lot.
Exactly. And the DocuSign, I think before I got here, we were maybe still mailing contracts. And so we, especially with with COVID, because I was a COVID hire, and all of the different things that just kind of forced us to a purely electronic process, I think that DocuSign has also helped us with that. And then one of the last things that we were talking about hiring, and, we look for ISs, but you're not looking for someone necessarily with legal experience, but you are looking for someone who does maybe have some of that sales experience that can translate. And when you find that person, you're still trying to make sure they understand a one-call close isn't necessarily pressuring, because it can feel like pressure, to maybe to some of your intake specialists. It's not pressuring. It's just making sure that they have the right representation.
Right. And that's the reason trust is so important. Your job is to build trust with that person. Because remember, they called us. That's one of the unique rules in the legal profession, is we don't call them, they call us. So this isn't like doing outside sales or cold calling where you get just a random call from somebody when they're not expected. This person was already predisposed to call you for some reason. Either they were referred to you by maybe your clients, maybe they saw your internet ad or your internet GMB listing or your pay-per-click or whatever media that you're running out there. They called you. So they're already predisposed to want to know more about you and want to know if you can help them. And that's part of the training when you're developing your intake staff. So I have an interesting book that I have based our intake closing process on. And if you remember The Wolf of Wall Street, who was it? Leonardo DiCaprio was the guy. What was the guy's name again?
Oh, no, I'm on the wrong person.
Okay, we're going to have to look this up on the break. But anyway, so the guy who was the character in Wolf of Wall Street who wrote the book, one of the things that he did within the movie was that he was training other stockbrokers on how to sell these crappy penny stocks that nobody really wanted. And he used the example, and he said, sell me this pencil. And I can't give the full analogy, but you have to go back and see the movie. But the point he was trying to make is you're not selling the features of the pencil. You're not selling the fact that it's long and thin, or it has lead in it, or it makes marks, or it has an eraser. Those are just the features. You're selling the benefit of the pencil. What is the benefit? Then the benefit is this pencil can solve your problem. This benefit is a tool that can allow you to communicate with other people your thoughts. So he kind of took it to that degree. So I kind of analogize this to what we're doing. We're not selling law. We're selling problem solving. We're here to solve your problem. And so if your intake people always approach it that they have a problem and we can help them solve their problem, and that's what we're trying to sell to the client. That's what we're trying to convince the client of, is that we are the people that can solve your problem.
Yeah, we're the solution.
We are the solution. So with that, he wrote a second book after Wolf of Wall Street called The Straight Line Selling Method, where he really went in and delved deep into his method, his sell the pencil method. And it was a really good, interesting book if you want to learn how to be a great salesperson. So I took that book and I developed a sales process for our intake team based on what he calls the straight line selling method. And the straight line selling method goes sort of like this. You gather information, you see if the person is qualified. Then you explain our value proposition, because that's what we have, is that we have a value proposition. In exchange for signing our contingency fee contract and giving us a portion of your benefits, we will provide all of these services. We will solve all of these problems. We will provide all of these benefits for you. We will alleviate the stress from your mind. So you're explaining the benefit of coming on with our law firm, and you're combining that with talking about our experience, our proven processes, how we move their case forward. And then you stop and you don't say anything and you wait for them to respond. Because what they're going to respond with is either a yes, at which point you get them to sign a contract, or they're going to respond with a no, at which point you respect the no, or, and what's more likely, is they're going to respond with I'm not sure. And what I'm not sure means is I have some reservation or I have some objection, what he refers to as objections, to completing the sale, from signing the contract. And then in the straight line selling method, it is the intake specialist's job to explore that and figure out what the objections are, what's holding them back. What are they concerned about? Are they concerned about the fee? Are they concerned that our fee is higher than somebody else's fee? That they could get a better deal somewhere else? Are they whatever it is? What are they concerned with? And what you figure out by talking to your intake specialist over time is that there's usually a very common set of objections that are raised. There's probably only about 5 or 6 objections that are typically raised. And so my job as the person designing the system is to give my salespeople a written response, a scripted response to each of these objections that we anticipate, to alleviate those objections, to get to this. When you ask them again, this for the second time, what would you like to do? You're trying to get them to yes. But it's a whole sales system, and it's very ethical. It solves their problem. It answers their question, but it's done in a very methodical way that you can train your people to do.
And you train our intake team.
I used to do more training than I do now. I have sort of trained my trainers, and I've developed this written system that we use that is very specific to disability law. We do 3 types of disability. There's VA, there's Social Security, there's long-term disability insurance. So each of those takes a slightly different tact, but there's a definite scripted methodology to take the client through the sign-up process.
And so to get to, I would say to get to what KPI? So what are some of the targets that you have for your intake department?
So here are some of the metrics that we look at. So the first thing, if you think about your intake department as a big funnel, so at the top of the funnel is every lead that comes into the funnel. Let's say 1,000. Say there's 1,000 leads that come into your funnel. They typically are going to come in 2 or 3 ways. Number 1 is going to be a live phone call. Number 2 is going to be some form fill from one of our web properties. And third could be a referral, say from an attorney. We get this a lot. We get an attorney will email me and say, hey, I have this client. I would like to have you talk to this client. That's probably the third way that they get into the top of the funnel. So let's say you get 1,000 leads in the top of your funnel, say over a month. What percentage of those leads that come into the top of your funnel are you actually able to contact and interview, like do a full interview to see whether they meet criteria, whether they meet qualifications? That's what we call our contact rate. We want to, and you would think in a perfect world, your contact rate would be 100%. That never happens. Never in a million years are we going to be able to contact 100% of the people that come into the top of the funnel for just a million reasons. Particularly when you do a lot of marketing, there's not a lot of your leads are not very sticky. So if somebody fills out a contact form on Facebook and then you try to call them back, there's a significant likelihood that they're not going to pick up the phone, or they lost interest, or they've moved on, or they didn't even remember doing it. So our standard is we would like a 95% contract rate. This is what we measure, and this is how we measure the performance of our intake department. Is number 1, on a month-to-month basis, did you meet your 95% contact rate goal? Now that rate has been sort of established over the years by trial and error, and we just know when we're doing really well. And this seems to conform with what other law firms have told me and in other masterminds or things like that. A 95% contact rate is pretty solid. So let's say you've contacted 950 out of those 1,000 leads that came through your funnel. How many of those do you actually want? How many of them are qualified that you want to sign up? And that number will be drastically lower. In the personal injury world, most people will say that you probably only want about 1/3 of your leads. I will say in the disability world, it's even less than that. Probably 12 to 15% of the leads that come into our system are what we call wants, qualified leads that we would like to sign up. So that means, you're digging through a lot of coal to find some diamonds here. So what the next one is, we would like to sign up 100% of the qualified leads. Now, again, we know that that's not likely to happen. It might happen over a short time period, but over the long run, you're never going to sign up every lead that is qualified that you want to sign up. I don't know the exact statistics on this, but I think most, when we go to PILMA, when we go to these intake things, they generally say if you're doing above 90% sign up rate on your qualified leads, you're doing pretty well. And I think that's pretty much the standard that we kind of abide by. You should sign up 9 out of 10 of your qualified cases because they've already come into the system. They've already taken the time. You've already met all of their objections. You've tried to allay all their fears. You should be signing up the vast majority, 90% of these leads. And then the final thing we grade on is the handoff. Well, it's not the only other thing we grade on. We grade on a lot of things, but the major thing is the handoff, because now intake has to transfer that case over to operations. Somebody's actually got to work on this case. There's got to be a smooth onboarding process because cases can fall off during that transition period. And that's something that I think we constantly work on. And it is a sticking point because, things can happen. Your operations people can go on vacation. They don't return the phone calls for 2 or 3 days. The clients have different expectations. Some people expect you to onboard them within 10 minutes. Some people think, 3 or 4 days is fine. But that's a particular area that I think that law firms need to look at very closely is that handoff procedure. It needs to go really, really well.
Since you're talking about transfers to the case management department, which is kind of sort of my baby, I'm going to say it goes a lot more smoothly than you think it does.
Well, tell me how it goes.
Because a lot of it is automated. So if you aren't utilizing technology to automate that transition, please ask your case management software how to do that, because it's definitely within the feasibility of it. And even when people do go on vacation, we make sure that there are redundancies, because I think that one thing you have hammered home into our departments is to make sure that the client does get that personal touch within 24, 48 business hours of the transition, because it is so important to you that the client hear from someone to ensure that, again, that trust, you made the right decision. There is an actual person working your case. We're going to be hearing from you. And of course, we've sent them the WOW package that's hopefully coming in the mail to make sure that we're actually legitimate. So I agree with you that it's one of the most important things. You've heard me say before, what's the most important part of a relay race?
The handoff.
The handoff. There you go.
There you go.
So the handoff. So wherever there's a handoff in any of your systems, that's where you're going to find some problems, and this is no different. But I think we do very well here at Marc Whitehead Associates.
Okay. We do a bang-up job because Diana said so.
Well, I just told you what we did. So I think you've talked about a lot of things. Before we go to our third segment, any other tools and maybe tips and tricks that you want to share with our listeners about how you found to get the most out of your intake team?
Again, none of this happens by accident. You have to create the process. You have to script literally every step of the way. And you have to train on it continually. It's not train them once and then set them free. It is a continual thing because people can backslide. People can develop bad habits. And you can just come up with better ideas. You can always do something to improve the system. So, I think we've mentioned this in the past in the podcast, but we're developing what we call MWA University, Marc Whitehead Associate University, for those who don't get the MWA.
The reference there.
The reference real quick. And we're creating all of these training modules. But the training modules are not only for new hires. These training modules are also designed for refresher courses for people that are already on staff. And I think the one that we've got developed farther down the line seems to be the intake department, because it's kind of number one, Erica's done a bang-up job.
Yes,
Shout out
has.
to Erica.
Shout out to Erica.
Erica, our intake manager. But that's the other thing is you're always hiring new people in intake because it is a high burnout job. Most intake specialists, unless they really are awesome and really love it, tend to, move on or want to move to a different department over time.
Yep, that does happen.
It's just a high burnout job, being on the phone all day.
Yeah, we find that a lot throughout the firm with the high burnout. So we've been very lucky to retain some excellent intake specialists who thrive on the competition and the job itself. Any final thoughts on maybe any tools that you might want to?
So I think what I'm going to do is we're going to save the tips and tricks to the end. So we're going to come back after this last break, and we're going to go through what I'm going to call the quick hitters, the quick tips on how to improve your intake system and process and intake department. And at the very end, for those who stick around, I'm going to make you a special offer on how to get our training manual for intake. But you have to wait to the very end. And we'll be back. All right, so just to clear up, I couldn't remember the name of who wrote Way of the Wolf. The book was Way of the Wolf, Straight Line Selling Method. By Jordan Belfort, who was the lead character, the subject of the movie Wolf of Wall Street, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, who actually did go to prison for all of his antics, which, of course, makes for a great movie. I mean, it'd be so boring just to talk about a stockbroker who just did stockbroking, so... But he went to prison. It was a whole thing. It was, what Margot Robbie was his second wife. He divorced his first wife. He left his first wife, who was like, a very solid woman, but not glamorous. And he, of course, being the Wolf of Wall Street that he is, he fell in love with the Margot Robbie character, who was very glamorous. And of course, they ended up snorting up half the cocaine in New York City. And it was a great movie. It was like one of my favorite Leonardo DiCaprio movies.
Okay, well, I was going to say, somehow this podcast became a movie review.
A movie review.
So what, 5 stars, Mark?
5 stars.
Highly recommend. Okay.
Highly recommend. 2 thumbs up.
But we're back to tools and tips and tricks on your managing your intake or just running your intake department.
So, again, I kind of took all of this from reading Way of the Wolf, which is basically a sales book. It's how to become a successful salesperson using the straight line selling method. But the way you transfer that knowledge over to other people into like your intake department is you anticipate the objections that are going to come. And if you think about it and sit down with all your people, it's not hard to figure out what the common objections are. There's probably, like I said, 6 to 12 common objections why people hesitate on signing a contract. And you come up with reasonable answers, to those objections, and you train your people on how to deal with that. So that's the big picture side of things. I told you I was going to give you some quick hits. So here are my quick hits. Number 1, frickin' make it easy. You need to simplify everything you do. Start with your contracts. I have seen lawyers' contingency fee contracts that go on for 5 or 6 pages. That is absolutely insane. We do our best to shorten our contracts to no more than 1 or 2 pages. We do our best to take out all the legalese out of it. We try to make them written in first person as well. Now, in the old days, we had to think about this. I think nowadays, you could take your contract and put it in ChatGTP and say, give it the parameters. I want to shorten this to 1 page. I want to take all the legalese. I want to make it usable for the average person at the 12th grade reading level. And whatever you want to do, and see what it spits out. But simplify your contracts so they're easy to explain over the phone. Okay? This is another thing you need to be training your intake people on, how to explain the contract in layman's terms. Okay? Obviously, these days, nobody wants to come in the office anymore. Plus, it helps you for people who live a long way away. Do DocuSign right on the phone. Have them, today's technology, you don't have to send out the overnights that cost you $20 anymore. You don't have to hope that the thing comes back in, a couple of days later. You don't have to hound people on signing the contracts. You don't have to make home visits. Simply sign them up. Let them sign their name on their own phone. And just develop a system. I know we've used DocuSign itself. What are the other systems out there that you can do e-signatures with?
HelloSign, Assure, I think, maybe.
Yeah, Adobe Sign. I've seen a lot of them out there, and a lot of them have different levels of protocols and securities depending on what your comfort level is, depending on, quite frankly, what your price level is.
Well, and in your integration into your case management software is a big driver.
Right. Obviously, if you can do it, which we have done, is everything is now integrated into Litify. It just automatically saves it into the system, and we're done. And you know what? If the doctors can do it, and they have done it, you don't go to any doctor these days. You don't sign paper anymore. Everything is signed with your fingertip. If they're secure enough with it, with all of their HIPAA regulations that they have to deal with, then it should be secure enough for us as lawyers. That's my humble opinion. But make it easy. You've got to make it easy for them. You do need, in the sales process, you need to create a sense of urgency. Okay, this needs to be dealt with quickly. In our case, our clients have a very limited amount of time to appeal a denial, so the urgency is naturally built into it. If you're doing a personal injury case, the evidence, rapidly, disappears, so you need to get on it quick. Come on, we need to get on it quick. If it's a criminal case, well, obviously this person probably has a court appearance in the next day or two, or week or two, or whatever it is. We need to get jumping on it quick. So you always need to stress the urgency, because inaction leads to clients just doing nothing. They walk off, they forget about it, or they forget you. I like using the success fee concept, which means we're not charging you a legal fee, we're charging you a success fee. We only charge you if we are successful. If we are not successful, there is no fee. So it's just a turn of phrase, but I think it actually helps people understand a little bit better the contingency fee model, which is we only get paid if we're successful. Call tracking, particularly callback benchmarks, because there are going to be a substantial number of people that you do not reach on the first phone call. So you have to follow up. One of the tips is make sure you look and see how your phone comes across. So in other words, you don't want your phone to ring on somebody's cell phone as potential spam. Mm-hmm. That will guarantee that they won't pick up the phone call. You want your caller ID to come across as law office of, or disability lawyers, whatever it is, the name of your firm, whatever your brand is, that needs to come across on the caller ID. And there are whitelisting methods out there. There are services out there that, for a fee, will make sure this happens for you. But the worst thing that can happen is if you come across as potential spam, because I guarantee you they're not going to answer the phone. So that's just a tip. Wow packages. We talked about wow packages a little bit. You need to wow your people with some good stuff. We send books, we send client handbooks, we send various swag, something to keep them interested. Your wow package can also include email. So one of the things we do is we email information to somebody, because that gets to them instantaneously. So maybe an ebook, a copy of your book in electronic version, in electronic format, or something like that. Something to kind of set the hook right at the very beginning. If you can demonstrate a track record of success, that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and that certainly varies by state. What you can say and what you can't say. What we say is Marc is board certified in disability law, which indicates a track record of success. Some people say we win X percentage of cases. I don't know if that's really works under the state bar rules. I'm not really sure. I haven't looked into it enough because I haven't looked at it enough. But you want to demonstrate a track record. You want to show your experience. We do say we've represented thousands of people over the years, and we have 33 years of experience. So these are all things that you can say to demonstrate a track record, because people are looking for that.
I think those are the top 5 that I think you hit the top one. So you kind of tease the audience with where they can get all of your tips and tricks and wisdom from an intake manual.
So we have our intake manual is designed for disability services, but it's easily translatable into anything else that you are doing out there. But it uses the straight line selling method. So I would say I would use this as an example, not as an actual tool, because it's so tailored to what we do. But it is our sales training manual that we have developed over the years, and we use this as the backbone of our intake and sales system. So I think I don't remember how many pages with the appendix it is, maybe 15, 20 pages. I've lost track. But I have it, and I have it in Word format. So if anybody wants it, I would be happy to email it to you, but you have to say when you email it, your request to me, you have to say, "I love your podcast."
And Diana is the better.
And Diana's the best. Some reference to the podcast. Give me some reference to the podcast.
Or leave a review.
Or leave a 5-star review. That would be awesome.
And we'll have our people looking for your 5-star reviews
as well. That's an even better idea. Send me an email, marc@marcwhitehead.com. Again, Marc is spelled with a C. And I will be happy to send it to you. And if you want to, after you read it and it's confused you want to discuss it, hit me up and we'll set up a phone call and I'll tell you how it works.
All right. So any parting thoughts, Marc, on intake? And we didn't even hit everything today, but just any parting thoughts on things we've discussed today?
It's all about eliminating the choke points and creating leverage within your firm. I used to be the only salesperson, okay? I couldn't grow because I was the choke point. So how do I leverage myself? How do I clone myself? And I think I'm the best salesperson out there. Personal bias, could be wrong, but I think I'm really good at it. Well, the way you do it is you have to create a system. You have to create a system where people can replicate the best parts of you, assuming that you're the one you're trying to replicate. So I think of how I would approach it. This is how I would say hello on the phone. This is how I would introduce the firm. This is how I would handle a particular situation, and you gameplay it out, and you keep going, how should this be handled? And then you create scripts based on how you would do it. And then you train people on that, and therefore you create leverage. So I've cloned 12 little Marc Whiteheads down in the intake department selling
terrifying
for me. It is terrifying. It is like a horror movie. But that's kind of how I think about it. And I spend a lot of time with these folks. I take them to lunch a lot. We talk, we role play a little bit. They ask me questions. Hey, Marc, I had this. Well, how would you have handled that? And so I pay particularly close attention to that section of the firm.
And everyone knows it.
Everybody knows it. Everybody in the rest of the firm is a little pissed because they think the intake department is my favorite. And truth be told, they are, because they make me the most money.
Well, and they're really good too. Not to say that the rest of our teams aren't, but there at least is a little internal rivalry there. So.
Yes, I love it when they get competitive with each other. That's fun, just to watch them go.
Yep,
it's almost like gladiators, But they will get competitive with each other.
They are. It's a good thing to see. They're a great team. So. Thank you for sharing with your thoughts on intake today.
Okay,
Marc.
I know this has just been a big mind dump today.
Very helpful, though.
I know. It's like I've been driving Diana crazy because I created an outline and I didn't follow it at all.
Not one bit.
Not one bit. I just started going.
That's okay.
Just started going. All right. But with that, we're getting the high sign. We got to get out of here. So I want to thank everybody for listening to the Successful Barrister Podcast, where legal legends are made. I'm Marc.
And I'm Diana.
And together we're the dynamic duo of law. So remember to rate and review us wherever you get your podcast. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, make sure you tell your friends. And visit us at successfulbarrister.com, and make sure to visit our sponsor, Marc Whitehead Associates, a national disability law firm, at disabilitydenials.com. And mainly, send me an email requesting our sales process and sales manual, and make sure you mention in the podcast how great Diana is.
Naturally.
Bye.
Bye.